Good afternoon, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, allies of research, science, innovation. Welcome to this session on the innovation principle. Thank you very much for being here. This is a co-creation, co-design session. We're on the eve of a new European Commission, a new European leadership. We're on the eve of a new framework program, Horizon Europe. We're also on the eve of doing things differently, as you may have heard from the opening session. We're co-creating our policy, our agendas, our priorities for the future much more than we've ever done in the past. And this session here this afternoon is part of this co-creation, co-design effort. Much is new, because we need new solutions. We need innovative solutions to make sure that we accelerate the transition towards a more sustainable and more competitive future. A future that is competitive because it is sustainable, and that is sustainable because it is competitive. So what matters more and more for us at the European Commission is that we do not only work on the rate of research and innovation, the quality and quantity of it, but also that we set directions. What is the purpose of all this research and innovation? And that's why we have put the Sustainable Development Goals at the heart of our policy and our program for the future. As you probably have seen from the Horizon Europe program, we really want to make sure that Europe is very good in creative destruction for sustainability, and that we avoid having a lot of destructive creation that would not be acceptable and sustainable for our society and our economy. In that vein, we have many ideas in Europe, we have many innovators, we have as many startups as the United States every year. The problem is that we have a hard time getting these new solutions, these new ideas to the market and make them get into value for our economy and our society. And that means that we need to adopt a very systemic approach to innovation. We need to look at all the framework conditions, including the regulatory framework. Make sure that the regulatory framework is conducive to developing the new solutions and scale them up to the market, European and even global markets, in support of sustainable development and or competitiveness. We've seen this now in a couple of instances where we have been designing the regulatory framework in the past, which was not maybe ready or anticipating the new kind of solutions that are coming. We have designed a lot of environmental legislation, for example, for a linear mode of production, consumption and throwaway, which is not always conducive, adaptive to a circular economy. So how do we make sure that our regulatory framework is conducive to bringing all these new ideas that help us realize sustainable development, bring these solutions to the market and to create value for society? That is what we will discuss this afternoon. The idea of the session is not that the Commission will say what it thinks and that the Commission will defend its point of view. We have three speakers here this afternoon who will kick off the discussion with us, and we have one rapporteur in the person of Signe Razzo, our Deputy Director General, who will draw some conclusions at the end. Not definitive conclusions, but takeaways from this 1 hour discussion this afternoon. The idea is, colleagues, that we have a very interactive session. So the three speakers will introduce, each one with 7 to 8 minutes, if possible. And the idea is that we then open up to the floor. We have also questions and comments that come in through Slido, which we can pick up during the discussion. I'll briefly introduce the three speakers who have accepted kindly to be here this afternoon. Thank you very much. We have Norbert Lutke Entrop with us, who is the chair of the Research and Innovation Working Group at Business Europe, but also very importantly, head of Corporate Technology and Innovation Management in the headquarters of Siemens. So having a very global perspective of research, science and innovation. We have Anne Stouffer with us, who is Director Strategy and Campaigns at Health and Environment Alliance. The acronym is a very nice one, HEAL, very appropriate for the work you're doing. Anne is very much involved in campaigns and activities on climate change, energy, air quality, and actually got recently an award for clean air in London, recognizing the efforts you've done in London for clean air. And we have also Andrea Renda with us, a leading researcher and expert working at CEPS, the Center for European Policy Studies. If I were to give you the list of his publications, we would need the rest of the day. But just let me say that Andrea is the co-author of a recently published book with a very appealing title, The Hidden Treasures of Europe. So maybe, Andrea, you can give us some hidden treasures as well this afternoon. So let's kick off. And Norbert, kindly over to you if you want to introduce the topic from your point of view.
Thanks a lot. As mentioned, I have innovation in my job title, so allow me to start with a plaidoyer for innovation. There's hardly a policy area where innovation does not play a crucial role. Whether it's traffic policy, where we talk about multimodal traffic systems, allowing for a better shift towards public transport, whether it's healthcare, where we need to extract higher value out of patient data, where we need more efficiency in the healthcare delivery systems, whether it's industrial policy, where I believe it's mostly about future industries that we want to grow in Europe. And above all, and I think this is the most important policy area these days when we come to climate policy, or more generally speaking, sustainable development. It's very clear we have not yet all the answers how to combat climate change. We don't know yet how to make technology affordable at large scales. We don't know yet how to get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which is something that is still a challenge at the horizon if we want to live with our climate models. So what I'm trying to say is innovation is so much permeating all policy areas, it makes perfectly sense to say we need in any legislation that we develop, we need an anchor point for considering the impact on our innovation capacity. And this is, I think, the innovation principle. If you're not convinced yet that this is one strong argument for having such a principle, consider also this. There is probably an underestimation about the impact of legislation and regulation on Europe's innovation power. So if you understand the innovation principle as just a means to avoid some nasty side effects of regulation, it's not that. In fact, in many examples, take mobile telephony, where Europe took an early lead thanks to prudent regulation. If you think to the growth of a competitive industry in renewable energy production, where we now are able to deliver clean energy at cost competitive levels and at scale, all this was thanks due to legislation that stood at the very beginning of these journeys. So what I'm trying to say is it's not so much the case of counterbalancing in our legislation the precautionary and the innovation principle. This is far too narrow-minded. It's really to use legislation to really unlock the full innovation power that Europe actually has. I guess this is the hidden treasures you are referring to. And secondly, there's one more argument why I would greatly see a stronger push for the innovation principle, and that is about Europe's reputation. So we are still perceived within Europe and also in the rest of the world as over-regulated, as being too slow in translating our great scientific knowledge into actual innovation that hits the road. And that reputation may be right or wrong. It's not an argument to basically step back from our prudent approach to protecting consumer rights and protecting our citizens. That's not the case I'm trying to make. But still, the innovation principle is a means to say we need to send a strong signal. Whenever we think about new laws, we need to think about what it means for our innovators, for their freedom to act, for their freedom to develop their ideas and to drive them to the market. So, and for these reasons, I'm a big fan of the innovation principle. Actually, I took the effort to read through the most important toolbox 21. Highly recommended reading. It summarizes nicely all the factors you need to consider when designing new laws. It gives you tips how to think about experimental clauses when you really want to try out something new. It gives you tips what can go wrong in a legislation, being too much technology focused, not leaving enough space for other roads to achieving the same goals. So I think it's a very valuable tool. And there's good examples out there where this has already been quite well applied. One example is the proposal on the reuse of water. So we looked at that, different policy options were outlined, the right questions were asked in a stakeholder consultation. Actually, there were different policy options actually assessed against their impact on innovation. So this is for us a best practice example. It's not yet, I have to say, fully implemented across the board. We see other proposals, let's say on the single-use plastics, where there are examples, anecdotal examples on how this might affect innovation, but it's not a systematic assessment yet. So my plaidoyer in total is to say, okay, we have this innovation principle established. The tool is as good as it can get. Let's apply it. Let's apply it more systematically across the board. Not in every case. There might be laws where clearly it doesn't apply, but in case of doubt, let's use it and make regulation for Europe more innovation friendly.
Thank you very much, Norbert. What I pick up from your intervention is that innovation is not a side issue. It's core to our policy making.
Yes.
And the innovation principle is not anti-regulation. It's actually to help us do better regulation.
Absolutely.
For delivering better results. It's of course important that this is generally understood, and that is, I think, where we still have an issue, and that's why I'm so glad that Anne has accepted to be here with us, because not everyone is sharing that view, and I think it's very important that we hear from all sectors in society and all stakeholders that we come to something that everyone is comfortable with and everyone can support, because as Carlos Moedas has just said in the opening session, Europe can be winner in science innovation because we have a political system that cares about it. But it means it must be caring for everyone. Anne, may I turn to you to give your perspective?
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to be part of the conversation this afternoon, which is, as we're an alliance of over 75 member organizations from the health community, working for better health through strong environmental and climate measures, looking at innovation and what the regulatory environment is, and all these kind of questions is also a question that we and our members very much deal with. And I wanted to kick off with sort of 3 observations from my side. And the first one is really that we think we urgently need innovation for transformation. We live in unprecedented times. I'm still very much under the impression of yesterday's UN Climate Summit, the marches last week, which threw millions of people on the street, which I think shows that there is very much, the general public is ready for transformative action to tackle the climate crisis, and we need that transformative action. We know we're running out of time, and we, also for innovation, this should be the guiding principle that we need to come up with solutions that will allow for a swift decarbonization and to protect our health. I think we've passed the stage where it's about putting plasters on. It's really making these more these deeper changes in our societies, in our ways of life, and all that's connected with it. And the second question is, of course, always regulation. What kind of regulatory environment do we need? That will foster innovation. And certainly, from our perspective, I'm interested to hear that what you're proposing for new laws. But what we would say is that when we have set goals, when we have binding goals and measures, that this is very much conducive to innovation. Because I hear this from industry a lot. This gives them regulatory security and certainty. But from our perspective, with a view to protecting health, this is what is needed. It's it's one thing to give incentives through financing, and I'm not saying it's bad, but this is only one part of the picture, and it certainly needs to have these binding and ambitious regulation, and that's also where I think we in the EU and in Europe we need to step up. We really need to step up when it comes to cutting down CO2, but also, I mean, since it's a whole environment crisis as well, and we know that nature's biodiversity is disappearing at unprecedented loss. Air pollution continues to be really the top environmental risk to our health. So I mean, we have all these unsolved problems. So I mean, this is where we do need the innovation to come in and help us solve that. And the third point I wanted to make is already continuing to what Norbert has been saying, is this conversation around precaution and innovation. And I think there's often this misunderstanding, I would say, or this myth that actually precaution hampers innovation. And I brought also something recommendation for you to read. It's quite thick. This is from 2013, and it's work carried out by the European Environment Agency. It's actually called late lessons from early warnings, science, precaution, and innovation. And I think what they've done really nicely and important is that they have dozens of case studies checking, how was it back then, for asbestos, for example? Did we react early enough on what we were hearing, or in the case of asbestos, we didn't act early enough, but other ones. And what they really show is that this, it's unfounded to say that regulatory measures or measures based on precaution will stop innovation. To the contrary, they would say, and this also makes a lot of sense to me, is that in terms of technology, why should we put all our eggs in one basket, so to speak? Is with a view to precaution, isn't it important to have kind of several lines of technological development, and until we're not sure what the health impact could be or the environmental impact, and then we can see. But if we kind of set everything into one technology first, then it's more difficult to get out of it again. Like in the case of asbestos or other chemicals, because there were no alternatives basically, and that makes it a lot more costly than in the end. So it's kind of actually the precautionary principle being a basis for Europe to be more innovative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. I think we all agree that we need innovation for transformation, and actually promoting this kind of innovation is probably the most important precautionary measure we can take these days, knowing what climate change can have as consequences. But I think you're right in pointing to the fact that we need to show and reassure people that we do this to protect health and well-being. And that is, of course, the question: how do we do this? How do we make sure that we allow for experimentation, for scaling up solutions, while making clear to people that this is not a free ticket to impinge on people's health, but that it's actually to protect health, well-being, and sustainable development. This is a bridge to you, Andrea, to see if you can combine all these perspectives and give us a few clues to the Commission services and the colleagues here on how we should work on this.
Thank you, Kurt, and thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be able to share ideas on this ever-evolving concept, which is the innovation principle. I do confirm that in the literature, precaution is not demonized, indeed, meaning that there have been not only studies that have compared the European and the American approach in a variety of sectors. For example, Jonathan Wiener from Duke University has been leading a number of studies in this field and has found that it is actually a case-by-case assessment of whether the EU is always more precautionary than the US. The other thing that I would like to say there is that when it's more precautionary, this is not necessarily against innovation. Indeed, there is a lot of literature. I mentioned my friend and co-author in a couple of occasions, Nicholas Ashford from the MIT. The precautionary principle can actually give direction to innovation. But of course, it doesn't have to introduce unnecessary constraints or even too much rigidity by locking in the market into a specific business model or technology, because this would deprive the civil society and the business sector of the variety of alternatives that they could experiment with in order to solve problems in various ways. The compatibility between the precautionary principle and the innovation principle is something that in the deeper academic literature is proven and is taken for granted by now. Now, that said, it's not easy in practice, because if you want to really incorporate elements of precaution and even more elements of sustainability into a policy that is centered around innovation, you might have to pay a number of prices and consequences. I can bring in my current experience as a member of the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence of the European Commission. There, we are experimenting with policy options that might promote the development of artificial intelligence. We see other superpowers experimenting with no breaks, and at the same time in Europe we would want artificial intelligence to follow a certain path which is more sustainable and which is more respectful of fundamental rights, for example, respectful of the environment and respectful of the health and citizens' rights. And also maybe, especially when it gets controversial, that is developed in a way that is shared. And now this is an extremely important verb, in my opinion. That is one of the turning points, in my opinion, in the change of paradigm that even the research has tried to make over time. And innovation is typically more sustainable when it's shared. And indeed, if you look at the history and the past developments in European innovation, as Kurt knows very well, because we've been repeating that on and on also with the RISE group and other advisory groups to the European Commission, Europe doesn't have a problem with innovation, per se. Europe doesn't even have a problem with startups, per se, as you were saying. Europe has a problem in innovation diffusion. And the diffusion of innovation and the fact that the whole society, consumers benefit from innovation, all companies, large and small, benefit from innovation, all this is something that is not equally met by alternative solutions to solve a specific problem, by all the innovation models. One example, the digital platforms model that we see today are creating enormous inequality in the US, are potentially disrespectful in some cases of the environmental consequences of the economy that they move. And in Europe, we have the possibility of experimenting with more distributed forms of governance that give an opportunity to compete to smaller companies, that give consumers the possibility of owning their data, and so on and so forth. Now, in all this, what has happened with the innovation principle is interesting for me, because first of all, the innovation principle is more than simply the tool. The innovation principle is three different things in the Commission. It is the idea of assessing impacts of innovation of the new proposals, and also in ex-post evaluation. So it's part of the better regulation guidelines with a specific dedicated tool. But it's also the idea of innovation deals, the idea that the entrepreneurs and innovators could challenge legislation by proposing alternative ways to comply with specific legal rules. And it's increasingly importantly horizon scanning. It is foresight. It is building technology roadmaps, understanding where technology is leading and how technology is reshaping the possibility frontier of what even policymakers can do. Now, if you look at digital technology, I look at you because Siemens is actually very good at that. We are seeing the evolution of things like edge computing and distributed computing, and we are seeing new governance models that allow us, for example, to give ownership of data to farmers, to go back to where the value is being created rather than when the value will be extracted. To me, this is a set of tools and concepts that are currently missing in the innovation principle as it stands, meaning the menu of tools for policymakers is exploding, and the alternatives and the possibilities to use regulation to give direction to innovation in the direction of sustainability is becoming, this possibility is really becoming exponentially bigger. Now, that said, what has happened so far, the fact that the innovation principle has been incorporated in this three-pronged, let's say, conceptual framework, so far has led to a result which, in my opinion, is not entirely satisfactory, which is most services of the Commission that work on a new policy initiative, they do their own cost-benefit analysis work in most cases, and then they ask themselves, oh, by the way, what's the impact on innovation? So the innovation principle has turned, also because of inevitable lack of skills in the Commission, and because not all services are DG research, has turned into an afterthought. Whereas for deeper transformation, we need to put innovation and the inputs from the research and innovation community at a much earlier stage in development. So we cannot have just a refit platform saying we need a simplification there, and then we do the innovation principle on top of this. We need the research and innovation platforms and communities together with civil society to voice in the need for a specific path towards disruptive innovation. And this is the reason why the Commission is proposing regulation, not an afterthought. This, for me, is one of the key paradigm shifts. To close this first presentation, this will become a complete endeavor only if we do one other thing, which is what the Commission itself has proposed to do and has committed to do since 2016, which is mainstreaming sustainability and sustainable development goals into each and every aspect of EU policy. Now, DG Research has done the homework. DG Research and Innovation has done the homework, meaning you have proposed a rise in Europe with the SDGs on page 1 and then on all the other pages almost, okay? But better regulation is currently not following the SDGs. So we don't assess new proposals on the basis of how this or that option would contribute to those SDGs or not. And I think this is an element of policy coherence for sustainable development. There would be a sea change in the way the Commission tackles better regulation. We cannot copy the Americans. They only do cost-benefit analysis on secondary legislation, federal regulation. We're doing impact assessment on very big pieces of legislation. We will do it on the new Green Deal. We will do it on many other things. We need to know how these policy options lead us to, closer to where we want to be in 2030. We don't want to know what's the net benefit and monetizing benefits and costs, which we know is a very tentative exercise. So cohesion policy, innovation policy, industrial policy, and this is happening, but also better regulation, all have to dance on the same drummer. And if we don't do this, I think the innovation principle will be a long-lost soul in the, and a lost animal in the zoo of better regulation. We don't want that. We want the innovation principle to be much more central, much more strategic, much more instrumental towards sustainability, and enable regulation to trigger not any innovation, but the innovation that we need to achieve the sustainable development goals.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you for the three speakers. I think it sums up nicely. Innovation should not be a side issue. We need innovation for transformation, and the innovation principle should not be an afterthought. But it means that we need innovation for sustainable development. And we in DG Research Innovation are very happy to see that Mrs. van der Leyen, the new president-elect, has put in the mission letters of all commissioners that everyone has to contribute to sustainable development goals. And innovation, of course, will have to be part of this, both in terms of our policy, but also in the way we do policy making through co-creation with the stakeholders, with yourselves, and with everyone here in the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, over to you. You've heard a number of complementary, not necessarily contradictory, if I may say, perspectives. Not yet, that may come, and that's part of the discussion this afternoon. So who wants to come in and break the ice with the first question or comment? And we have microphones.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Nina Holland from Corporate Europe Observatory. We have extensively analyzed also the coming into being of the innovation principle. I have requested all the communication between the European Commission and lobbyists, notably the European Risk Forum, which designed this innovation principle, who represent fossil fuel, tobacco, and the chemical industry, so the high-risk industries. They have basically, without any societal debate, without involvement from NGOs, trade union, or consumer groups, managed to push this through the European Commission and the Council, through the Dutch presidency, into a Council document. And now it is implemented. So to talk about policy making and co-creation, I don't think the innovation principle is an example of co-creation. I think it was very one-sidedly pushed. The emails that I obtained show that it is very much focused. The examples are given by the European Risk Forum were very focused on the pesticide and the chemicals legislation. This is really where the pressure is, and these very key legislations are highly under attack by the same groups that are member of this European Risk Forum. So it might sound very benign and you could interpret it in many different ways, that it could be innovation for sustainability, but there's nothing that guarantees that actually it will be implemented in that way. The tool does not give the right criteria to only stimulate innovation that really works for society as at large, the public interest in general, and not just a narrow economic interest. So actually, research shows that the precautionary principle, which is always mentioned, hardly ever is even applied enough. So I think that what we really need to look at is how did this instrument come into being, whose interests were heard, and how will these the interests of trade unions, consumer group, environmental groups that have all, public health groups that have all opposed introducing this principle as a standard new impact assessment for all new legislation without any proper democratic debate. How are you going to involve all of these stakeholders and interested parties in the future?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the question is, are we falling in the trap of bad industry? And can we work on the innovation principle in a novel way, in the way that it is really co-created with civil society, with all the actors in society? Anyone from the panel who wants to react?
Well, you can go ahead. I have some thoughts about this, but I don't necessarily need to go first.
Go ahead first.
Okay. Now, to me, I think I have, as an element of clarification, and then Kurti, correct me if I'm wrong, because we've been more or less on this, going through this together. I was there, meaning I have seen the European Risk Forum and the letters of the CEOs going to Barroso, then Juncker, invoking the innovation principle. But I also, at the same time, more or less, or a bit earlier than that, was writing papers for DG Research on the impact of EU legislation on innovation. And my understanding at the time, it was called ERIAB. It was this advisory group to the Commission. My understanding is that the way in which the innovation principle was developed inside DG Research and with the help of external experts is is completely different from what was being advocated outside DG Research. And I know this is unfortunate because the same label was used in various ways. On the industry side, in my opinion, initially there was a strong anti-precautionary principle stance that was mitigated over time. On the side of the research that we were bringing forward, including the innovation and decarbonization articles that I've written with Nicholas Ashford, but also the internal reflections of the ERIAB and the RISE, all this has always been a completely different type of conceptual framework, where innovation is considered to be something that needs direction to lead to sustainability. So I think it's time to get rid of this false start. So I agree that the co-creation and the shared elements needs to be brought into this picture a lot more. Let's forget the false start and let's look at what is being done in the application of the innovation principle and how we can adjust those tools. Because it can be extremely powerful, but as I said before, it needs to be a shared tool.
Norbert, you want to add something?
Only a little. So you have to bear with me. I was not involved in the generation of the innovation principle. So I cannot tell you whether the beginning was fishy or not fishy. I don't know. I can only judge as it is today. Speaking from a Siemens perspective, so we are not tobacco, we are not chemical. We still strongly support this tool or this principle. Not against a precautionary principle. We have discussed this before. It's really complementary. And I don't see actually why we should create here an artificial conflict, which in my opinion isn't there. And from a Business Europe perspective, I can also confirm that among all industries that are out there, the support is quite general. I clearly do not have the impression that this is driven by only a few particular industries.
Anne, you want to add a few
But I think
comments?
what we have to be very mindful about is that innovation doesn't become the overarching instrument for everything then. We need to look into the context. What are we innovating for? As I mentioned, we need to innovate to protect us, to tackle climate change, to protect the health from environmental threats. And so, what mustn't happen is that innovation is used as an excuse to weaken or to prevent environmental and climate protection laws and measures. And that's where I think That's what we would all be working on. It was nice to hear that we sort of agree on sustainability and the importance. And you mentioned the mission letters, and that was good to see. At the same time, in all of the mission letters, was the inclusion of the principle one in, one out. So whenever one piece of new legislation is introduced, another one has to go. So, but what does that mean? I mean, I think in the EU we're really proud of having this good body of legislation on environment and health and on climate, and we're still world leaders. Sometimes we forget because we talk so much about the details, but I mean, other countries are looking onto us, and we have to make sure we keep that leadership role. And with that principle of we'll chuck something out. I mean, I don't think we can, because all of the laws that we have are really key to protecting us. So how will that go together, those two principles? We think they don't, so we need to, we're asking Parliament to actually, abolish that principle of one in, one out. Yeah.
You're right to point to the question of leadership on smart, good regulation. If Europe does it well in certain areas like chemicals and others, we actually become a standard-setting body for the rest of the world. But it means that our innovation or regulation must be innovation conducive as well. And you raise a very important question, I think: is all innovation good? Can the innovation principle, and this is a question that came in through Slido, could the innovation principle help us to separate good from bad innovation? Huge question. I have my views on the one in, one out, but I'll keep that for myself for the time being, because the floor is open. Yes, please.
Hello. I had a question about the concept of regulatory sandboxes. So certain countries in Europe, especially UK, they are developing this concept of regulatory sandboxes, especially when concerns data protection. What lessons are you learning or advising in this? Because there are at least 10 projects that have been accepted, one on facial recognition, and we saw these developments can create certain tensions.
Thank you very much for the question. Does anyone from the panel want to answer this one? Yes, please. Or someone from the audience?
This is an industry perspective again. We like it a lot, simply because some regulatory environments are so complex that you can spend endless time debating all the pros and cons and what might happen and what will happen. So the idea of just trying it out in very controlled circumstances together with the regulator, and then learn from it and really design regulation not based on theory but really on practical insights. For us, this is a very charming perspective. It's also for us an accelerator that we can basically maybe achieve a few things faster because we simply gain practical experience much sooner. So from our perspective, we like them a lot.
Andrea?
Regulation has to change because the pace of innovation and technological development is so breathtaking that regulation needs to become much more agile. In the UK, for example, Nest has developed this concept of anticipatory policy making. In academia, we always speak of adaptive experimental policy making. It is important that these do not remain buzzwords. To design a regulatory sandbox is extremely complicated. To embed the requirements that would allow to draw lessons that would then enable such a delicate decision as to scale up the technology to the market level, this is something that is taken very lightly. There has been an explosion of regulatory sandboxes around the world. Not only in the UK, in Europe also. The German government has recently completed a study on ongoing regulatory sandboxes around the world and in Germany as well. In my opinion, experimental policy making would be crucial to understand and see specific technologies in a given environment, but the sampling of consumers, of use cases, the data governance around this, the possibility of observing the data, not only the design of the experiment, but also how the data will be communicated in the end. How do you verify the trustworthiness of this data provision? All this is not very well carved out in any manual of better regulation and experimental policy making. Randomized controlled trials have a much longer tradition, and in my opinion, this I also quote, for example, the STI division of the OECD. I had a discussion with them. They said regulatory sandboxes in the future will have to be designed a lot more like very well structured randomized controlled trials than simply trying out things.
Can I turn to the audience and maybe see a show of hands of who of you believe that the Commission should allow and promote regulatory sandboxes through our research innovation program, Horizon Europe? Who would be in favor of seeing this? Not too many, a couple, but it's not
Who's
the
against?
majority. So that's an important message, an important feedback. There was another person who wanted to... Yes, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Barbara van Dijk. I work at the University of Sussex Science and Policy Research Unit. I would like to answer your question of is innovation all good and can the innovation principle help to separate? I think the answer is in the question. It's obviously innovation is not necessarily good. Like take the example of DDT, pesticides. It probably was very innovative at the time. I don't think we could say it's good if we evaluate it today. And then if we would think if the innovation principle should help us exactly to separate different types of innovation, let them call them that way, then we have exactly the precaution principle, which is in a way an innovation principle, because precaution principle is steering innovation. If we keep on putting the innovation principle next to the precautionary principle as if it's two comparable principles, I think we are misleading everybody involved in the debate. So why don't we say something like the growth first innovation principle versus the precaution innovation principle, or the industry profit before anything innovation principle? I think that would be much more correct to what's actually happening today. So we would need to give it different signifiers to make clear what type of innovation we are talking about.
Thank you very much. We need to give purpose and sense to innovation so that, as I said in the beginning, we have more creative destruction rather than destructive creation. Does the panel agree with that? Any operational recommendations?
Actually,
Please
I'm
no.
a bit hesitating whether the question makes sense, because who eventually decides whether innovation is good or bad? Who will take the decision? Is it the consumer who purchases a product and decides it should be good for me because I'm paying for it? Is it policymakers with all their wisdom that decide for the consumer what is good for you, what is not good for you? So I think the question, what is good innovation, what is bad innovation, is not so trivial. Even the example that was mentioned, DDT, I think at the time of the inception, it was widely agreed it's a great stuff that is good for mankind. And later we found out, no, it's not so good. So I think this is a tricky question. It probably goes beyond the scope of an innovation principle. It really touches fundamentally how we take decisions in society, how we take judgments on what is good and what is bad. And this I would not see in the scope of an innovation principle. So this is broader than that.
Okay. Yes, there's a question here.
Thank you. I'm Marisa Papaluca. I used to be the Senior Science Advisor at the European Medicines Agency, and now I'm an academic, purely academic. I have a question as a citizen, just a simple citizen. And my question is the following, two questions actually. One is about how do we, citizen, understand what's going on in the horizon? I mean, horizon scanning. I've been working on horizon scanning the last 5 years at the agency. It's such a complex endeavor. And I think we had the very wonderful approach because we've been scanning the horizon, consulting an array of stakeholders, and actually we then published our strategy to the public for 6 months for anyone to be able to come back to us. They had now, because I retired, more than 400 contributions, and then the staff is working to see which direction the stakeholders want all these horizon identified elements to go for. I mean, the problem of the concept of innovation is that it's in closed rooms. And then how many closed rooms? I put also a question in writing. We have so many bodies, so many groups, so many advisors, so many people. As a citizen, I try to put the word innovation in various websites, and you have a plethora. Who is working, for example, this European Innovation Council, tomorrow I will go to see what it's about. What is their role? How they interact with you, how they interact with the industry, how they interact with patients and other organizations, other NGOs. I think what we miss in Europe, really, is clarity for the wide public including scientists. Where we want to go? And who says what? Because if you start looking at all the production on this concept, that all the bodies around the system, the European environment, you just don't know what to do anymore. Sorry, maybe it's a naive question, but it's not just the regulation, it's really how interaction with the public occurs.
I think your question touches on the heart of the issue, which is democracy. And how do we make democracy function, especially at an age when innovation is going so quickly? Everything becomes complex. We have disinformation, we have all these kinds of threats or questionings of the way of democracy works or democratic institutions. And that's actually also where science come in. And maybe what I can venture as an argument is that by having a worldwide unique program like Horizon Europe, bringing together science and innovation, we can maybe make sure that whatever we do in terms of innovation is science-based, that it is transparent, that everything happens in a very open, co-created manner. This is only one part of a big question where maybe with Horizon Europe we can start to offer elements of a possible answer. That's an argument I dare venturing. I don't know if the panel wants to pick up on that.
Yeah. If you allow me 20 seconds, I want to go back to the question from the researcher from Sussex. I think there are two different types. There is some innovation that is not as useful as other innovation for sustainability, okay? Which is not going as far as the DDT example, of course. But the selfie is an innovation. Netflix's recommendation engine is an innovation in which Netflix pours a lot of money. All this are not necessarily contributing to innovation. So if anything, I think that the real innovation that you should concentrate on is the one that adds value and goes towards sustainability, and this is something that should be at the center. Then the DDT example, just try not to avoid that you disagree too much, is a good example of the fact that once you have taken the final decision that precaution has been overcome and you can allow a product on the market, regardless of the DDT example, that's the beginning of the story, meaning that you start monitoring those impacts over time and be able to insert safeguards throughout the process over time. On your question, I think one good example and one attempt, and we will see whether also DG Research will have the courage to push it through to the end, is the idea of, first of all, simplifying enormously the partnerships, bringing the number of partnerships that look at specific sectors and domains, consolidating them, but also in particular the launch of missions and mission-oriented innovation policy. Because those missions are indeed aimed at creating results and achieving outcomes that will be, in principle, very visible to citizens. And there is an element on those missions, and we'll see how the governance shapes up over time, of co-creation also of the scope of the mission, the tools, the instruments that will be adopted or tested in order to achieve those missions. From smart cities to pediatric cancer to soil and food. There's 5 different missions that are being launched. I think it's a good first attempt to bridge, the ivory tower and the more, let's say, rainmaking approach to providing funds to innovation into bridging science and innovation towards concrete results. And the missions, of course, are nested in the Sustainable Development Goals in the first place.
So 2 points. One is also to sort of conclude that conversation on who is to decide what is good and bad innovation. I do think that we have a framework, and in some instances it is easy to decide because we have the EU treaties. We have certain rights and certain principles enshrined there, including the protection of our health, the protection of the environment. We have the precautionary principle also included in there. So I mean we do have that framework on judging things for. And then in terms of involving the public, I think that it's key. And actually, I wanted to share a very I find really exciting and positive example, which is the innovation that has taken place in the area of air quality monitoring. I mean, all these low-cost, affordable devices you now have on the market, it's incredible. And I guess that was just a market that developed. You know, there wasn't much, regulatory framework or anything, but there was really, there was a need from the citizens. They wanted to know about the air quality, in their cities, and which has led to the fact that nowadays you can go on websites and you can find out about air quality anywhere in the world. We have it with an initiative. We use low-cost devices with an initiative that's called Unmask My City, where we work with doctors and health-affected groups, asthma patients, and they can actually go and monitor, what's the air quality in the street that I'm walking to work and things like that. And then you have it, again, innovation, you have it open source, everybody can see the data. Researchers can use the data, they can do health impact assessments, all these kind of things. I mean, this kind of innovation for society is good. I think that is something that should really be put top there. So.
Technology and innovation can help democracy, can help transparency. I remember there used to be a mayor of London who was not too happy about all these data on air quality that came through novel sensors. He's now in a different position these days, dealing with other issues. Yes, please.
Hello, I'm from a country that still puts up with that certain gentleman, if he's not in jail. So I wanted to help the gentleman from Simons with this idea about how can an innovation principle deal with what is good and bad innovation. Let's give a concrete example of genetically modified food, genetically modified crops. There was an innovation that through democratic debate, through the European Union, was then kept off the shelves, not grown in the ground, because a democratic process and a citizen boycott kept it off the shelves. Now, going back to the late lessons from Early Warnings book, which uses this as a case study, it is very clear now when you see how GM crops have continued the erosion of life support systems, and in India, as many people as this room every day committing suicide because of the intensive pesticide and debt causing agriculture it produces, that GM has been a complete disaster worldwide. And thank goodness there was a democratic debate in the EU, messy though it was, to keep GM and keep Europe ahead in the precautionary stakes of lots of less fortunate parts of the world. But being a large corporation, certainly from the perspective of ETC Group, where I'm from, generally means for lots of these technologies, it means never having to say you're sorry. Now, Siemens, I understand you may not be a tobacco corporation, but...
Can you come to the question, please?
The question is, could we have an apology from Siemens for decades of creating the very climate change that Greta Thunberg, who was celebrated in the keynote just now, said, how dare you? How dare you say that you're not involved with the fossil fuel intensive schemes we now appear to be locked into? And maybe part of an innovation principle is for corporations like yours looking back and saying sorry, and actually an innovation principle in the future allowing that truth and reconciliation with groups that then might work with you.
Thank you very much for the question. We're going through a transition in our economy, which is much more climate friendly. And I think it's the corporate sector overall that has to make that transition. It's not one or the other company, it's a whole corporate world that is on that path. Norbert, do you want to react to this?
Yeah, briefly. Clearly, corporations are not saints. I'm not pretending that. After all, we are made up of human beings, like other sectors of society. So I will not pretend that all is good and perfect at Siemens. I will not do that. On the other hand, I do not see a reason to apologize either. I was personally involved, when was it? 2005. We started really to think hard about what is the future of the energy sector. And at that time already we painted pictures where there were lots of wind turbines, even out in the sea, lots of solar panels on the roofs. We saw that coming very quickly. And we said, okay, this is a trend that we, as a company, need to take serious. And in the process, we decided to enter into the wind turbine business, and we built what is today the market leader in offshore wind turbine generation, thereby also contributing to a significant extent to the decarbonization of the energy sector. It's true, our turbines, our gas turbines, are the opposite. Here I could engage in a long discussion that you also cannot just stop a business from today to tomorrow, try to close a factory in Germany. But I do believe these trends towards a sustainable development, we saw them coming early. We reacted maybe not perfectly to them, but I'm not ashamed of how we reacted to that.
Thank you very much. And that's the whole purpose of Horizon Europe and European Research Innovation Policy, that we stimulate science, research and innovation for solutions that bring us to that sustainable path of development, so that we preserve our prosperity and our fundamental rights in the future. Colleagues, thank you very much. This brings us to the end of this session. I'm under severe instructions to keep to the time limits. We cannot go beyond 60 minutes, but I would like to give the floor now to my colleague Signe Razzo, Deputy Director General at DG Research Innovation, leading a task force on an internal group on the innovation principle, to maybe give us a few of your thoughts, Signe.
Many thanks, Kurt. Dear speakers at the panel, many thanks also for the questions from the audience. Now I tried just to give a few takeaways on my behalf after the discussion that I followed here, and actually I'd like to start what Anne was saying at the beginning, that actually that our societies are now ready for transformation. We actually see that our young generation is particularly ready for transformation. They are actually asking us to transform the societies, to make them greener, to make them more sustainable. And I think this is something actually that we need to do, and a very important enabler to make it happen is innovation. So what I'd like to say, that innovation is not an aim in itself. Innovation is actually an enabler to have better, more sustainable societies, which care for the people, which care for the health, which care for the environment. And actually, even if we had some controversy in the discussions, and I think it's good, because it's first, it's then it's also more interesting to follow, but it also keeps people thinking actually where we aim at. And what I'd like to say, that these two principles that we made a reference today, the precautionary and innovation principle, can actually go very well together, reinforcing each other. Clearly, in a way, if they are inclusive. So innovation principle should also be inclusive, so everybody should be included in that. But when we are now looking for the great challenges and also the main priorities for the President-designate, Ursula von der Leyen, has revealed, say, the Green Deal for the first 100 days, then becoming the first carbon neutral economy by 2050. Clearly, in order to be able to do so, we need innovation. We need innovative solutions. Meaning that we also need to experiment, even if the sandboxes, regulatory sandboxes, were not the most popular tool here under the audience. It's not always easy also the regulators, it's not always easy to foresee what will actually happen. So if you really enable also experimentation on a smaller scale, then you can also find the ways, what would be the best approaches. I would a bit argue with Norbert, who said that, yes, Europe is known worldwide as we are very slow in regulation. I think that actually in very many areas, particularly in the environmental area, we've actually been showing that we can be leaders. we can be leaders in regulation, also using innovation and actually enabling innovative solutions. That's why this is also one of the reasons why our green technologies are now really at the forefront worldwide. Because our industries, it was imposed on them that they had to think of new solutions in order to be able also to meet the requirements. So it was also one of the ways. Now, when it comes technologies like AI, Andrea mentioned artificial intelligence. You also know that it's one of the priorities also to develop regulation on artificial intelligence, which could be also a potential area where we can actually show leadership on regulation, as we've done, for instance, in GDPR. When we developed that, I was in DG Trade. And as in trade, we know that we need to exchange a lot of data. So we were actually a bit concerned with this new regulation. But now what I've seen that more and more countries and nations actually take an example. And they realize that they also need the protection of data along the lines as Europe has done. So I'd like to conclude that in order to find then the best solutions, we need a concerted effort. We need all the players. We need the industry, we need the regulators, we need civil society, we need all citizens who can actually also try out. As your very nice example of measuring the air quality has shown, we also have citizen science, which is also one of the ways as actually the citizens can be also scientists or part of science. So I'd like to conclude actually also with a phrase, with a thought from Andrea that we need to bring innovation principle at the forefront in order to enable necessary transformation to achieve sustainable development goals. So, as said, the principle is not there for the sake of the principle, but the principle can actually bring us the good objectives that we are seeking for. So, many, many thanks to all of you of participating in this session, and actually we can continue this discussion throughout these 3 days. So enjoy the Research and Innovation Days, and thanks for joining us.